The ringing of the telephone shattered the morning silence. Sarah froze in the small kitchen, her hand pausing mid-pour of tea. Hot water spilled over the edge of the cup, but she didn't notice. The old rotary phone, silent for so many years, suddenly vibrated like a call from beyond. In her mind, a vague premonition instantly turned into a darkness sweeping through her consciousness. She hesitated for a few seconds, then lifted the receiver, her heart constricting. "Hello, Mrs. Freeman. This is Officer Ronald Gale from the Eldridge Police Department. We found a canvas bag in the Ouachita forest. There were a few items inside. I think you should take a look at them. There's a minister's robe, a Bible with the name Elijah Freeman written on it, and a stuffed doll named Jojo, quite old. The left ear is torn, but it's been sewn back on with red thread." Sarah stood motionless. In that instant, all sound seemed to drain from the world. She could only hear her own breathing, rapid and broken. Jojo. The name pierced her mind like a needle through her chest. It was the cloth doll that Micah, her son, used to clutch every night before falling asleep. One ear had been torn, and she had sewn it back on with red thread, a detail so small that only family would know. It couldn't be a coincidence. Silence. Sarah gripped the phone, the blood draining from her face. "Do you recognize these items?" Mrs. Freeman Ronald asked again. Sarah took a shallow breath. I need some time. I'll come to the station to identify them." Her voice cracked, but it was no longer trembling. "Yes, I understand. We'll keep everything as it is until you arrive," Ronald replied. Sarah hung up the phone carefully, placing it down as if a loud sound might awaken something that had been dormant for nearly 3 decades. She turned her hand, trembling so much that she almost knocked over an old photo on the table. Elijah was holding Micah, the little boy, smiling brightly in his father's arms. Sarah reached out to touch the cold glass, muttering incoherently. Emotions surged within her, but not tears. It was an awakening, something she had suppressed for 27 years. The suspicion that the disappearance all those years ago was not due to an accident or natural disaster, but something deeper, something darker. She walked into the study, opened an old wooden drawer, and pulled out a faded leather notebook and a stack of family photos. Each page, each stroke of the pen, was a fragment of memory she had carefully recorded, as if clinging to something precious that was slowly fading away. She stopped at the page with the scrawled entry, "Last day Elijah and Micah were seen September 14th, 1977. Below it was a question that had been crossed out many times. Did anyone see them after that? Sarah didn't call back. She grabbed the notebook, the photos, and went to her car. The old Ford smelled of mildew and oil, its tires squealing on the pine needle-covered road. Through the misty windows, the Ouachita trees appeared like fences of a memory she had once wanted to bury. And gradually, those distant, painful memories washed over her again. That year, the snow fell heavily and earlier than usual. On October 14th, 1977, a day she would never forget, Elijah Freeman prepared to leave home to deliver the sermon at Mount Olive Church as usual. He put on his minister's robe, carrying his familiar Bible. Micah, then, just 7 years old, held tightly to his worn Jojo doll in one hand and tugged at his father's robe with the other. "I want to go with you today, Dad," he said, and Elijah, as always, couldn't refuse. Sarah stood at the door, wiping a coffee cup she hadn't had time to drink, her eyes following the figures of father and son as they disappeared behind the row of pine trees. That was the last time she saw them. When the sun rose high and Elijah still hadn't arrived at the church, the parishioners began to whisper. By noon, no one could remain calm. Sarah drove along the route from home to Mount Olive, calling out the names of her husband and son among the tall grass on the roadside. But all that answered was silence. The police got involved quickly, but after only 3 days they came to a conclusion. No signs of a struggle, no clear crime scene. Most likely a crisis of faith. Mr. Freeman may have voluntarily left with his son to start a new life. That statement, cold and concise, was like a knife that extinguished all of Sarah's efforts. She screamed at the investigator, "Elijah wouldn't abandon the church. He wouldn't abandon me. He would never abandon Micah." But all the records had been signed. The case was closed. Only Sarah remained with the emptiness and the whispers at night as she pressed her ear to the empty pillow beside her. "Elijah, if you're still alive, why don't you come back?" But no one came back. Only time, and a silence that grew thicker with each passing year, like earth covering an unfinished sentence. The police station came into view in the distance, a small red brick building standing quietly in the center of town, as if it too had grown accustomed to being forgotten. Ronald Gale greeted her in the reception area. He was about her age, but his eyes reflected the wary caution of someone accustomed to dealing with stories that had no ending. On the table was a worn canvas bag, the edges fraying. Sarah sat down, taking a deep breath. When he opened the bag and handed her the old Bible, she recognized the writing on the cover, immediately Elijah. But what almost made her drop the book was the handwritten message at the bottom of the last page. "God sees everything. I can't stay silent any longer." Sarah stared at the words. It wasn't a prayer, it was a confession. Or a signal. A break. A beginning. Her heart pounded. And for the first time in nearly 3 decades, she heard Elijah's voice echo in her mind as clearly as if he were standing beside her. "I can't stay silent any longer, Sarah." She reached out slowly, taking out her old phone from her pocket, starting the camera, and carefully photographing each item: the worn Bible, the writing on the cover, the dried blood that had soaked into the paper. Each photo was like a stamp on her memory, not just to keep evidence, but to hold on to a part of the truth she feared she would forget. When Ronald nodded in agreement that she could keep the photos, Sarah said nothing more. She closed the bag, stood up, her movements slow but sure. Her eyes didn't wander her feet, stepping out into the long hallway that smelled of old wood and stale, bitter coffee from the waiting room. Reaching the steps of the police station, she stood still. The early sun shone at an angle through the trees, casting shadows on the damp asphalt. Sarah didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, as if held back by something that had just fallen, just awakened. She knew from that moment on, she would no longer be at peace, but she no longer wanted to be at peace. And then, like a machine that had been dormant and suddenly roared back to life, she quietly walked towards the old car, not to leave, but to begin finding what should never have been buried. That night when she returned home, she didn't turn on the living room light. Instead, she went straight to Micah's old room, where the small bed was still covered with a quilt. On the desk was a reading lamp that no longer worked. Sarah took an old map from the drawer and spread it out on the table. With a red pen, she marked the Wachita Forest, the location where the bag was found. Then she wrote beside it, "Jojo, the starting point." She stood up, looking out the window at the backyard where Micah used to run and laugh, echoing in the afternoon sun. Today, the sky was still cloudy, but Sarah's eyes were no longer as cold as before. They no longer held ashes, but fire. The fire of a mother willing to rekindle old memories if it could lead her to the truth. Early the next morning, Sarah decided to return to the church where Elijah had worked and devoted himself for so many years to find what time had buried deep for nearly 3 decades. Sarah's eyes never left the scene ahead as the wheels rolled through the broken-hinged wooden gate, the creaking echoing in the empty courtyard, sending shivers down her spine. She didn't get out of the car right away. For a long time, she just sat there, hearing in her head the church bells that used to chime every Sunday morning, Micah's giggling as he chased the pigeons, and Elijah's voice resonating from the pulpit as if embracing this small community in his arms. But all that was now just old, faded recordings repeating in her memory. The main door of the church opened slightly as she approached. In the darkness of the hallway, 2 men emerged, Harold and George. Harold was tall, thin, his shirt as smooth as if it had just been ironed this morning, walking slowly and evenly as if leading a ritual. George, on the other hand, had a ruddy complexion, a forced smile always on his face, his eyes constantly avoiding hers. "Sarah, you've come back. That's wonderful," Harold said, his voice as steady as the sermons he had given years ago. Sarah nodded slightly. "I need to go into Elijah's office for a bit." The atmosphere seemed to tighten in that moment. George stepped forward, dangling a bunch of keys. Of course. But are you sure you want to go in? Maybe the memories will make you uncomfortable." "Give me the keys, George." The statement was decisive. Harold looked at George and then slowly nodded, as if granting permission. George reluctantly pulled out a tarnished silver key and placed it in Sarah's hand. The room was located behind the main hallway, the heavy wooden door making a sighing sound as it opened. Inside it was dimly lit, with only a little light filtering through the cobweb-covered window. Dust lay thick on everything: the desk, the bookshelves, the photo frames. But the chair Elijah used to sit in was still there, pulled back slightly as if he had only just left yesterday. Sarah began to open each drawer. Bibles, letters, notes about the service. Everything seemed to have stopped on a day in late 1977. Finally, she found a small notebook, brown leather-bound, clipped between 2 pastoral documents. She flipped through the pages quickly, and there it was, numbers dancing before her eyes. Cost to repair sound system, $5,200. No invoice attached. Special security services, March, May, August, total $3,800. No unit name, no description. Elijah never overlooked these things, Sarah muttered. He kept it for a reason. Her voice no longer trembled. George stood huddled outside the door, his forehead beaded with sweat, his eyes not daring to look at the notebook. "It must just be a counting coincidence," he stammered. Harold stepped forward, his eyes narrowed slightly. "Those expenses were approved by the finance committee. There's nothing shady, Sarah, but you know Elijah was sometimes too sensitive." She left the church in silence. As she stepped down the steps, she turned her head to look over her shoulder. George was still standing there, smiling faintly, while Harold had already turned away. In Sarah's heart, a firm sentence rang out, not words, but a realization. They don't look me in the eye, but they know what happened. And now she would know too. Night had fallen on Eldridge. Sarah's wooden house was as quiet as it had been for years, but in her heart a storm had begun to brew. After returning from Mount Olive Church, she didn't turn on the living room light, didn't boil water, didn't even take off her dust-covered coat. Instead, she went straight down to the basement where she hadn't set foot for nearly 2 decades. The old storage room still smelled of damp wood and musty paper. Under the stairs were cardboard boxes neatly arranged by year, by name, by memory. She squatted down, running her hand over each faded inscription until she stopped at the words Elijah 1976-1977. A single box. No one else was sorted separately like that. She pulled it out into the middle of the room, wiping the thick layer of dust from the lid with her sleeve. Inside, layers of memorabilia were meticulously arranged, typed sermon manuscripts, letters to believers, a few Bibles with personal markings, and deep at the bottom, wrapped in a faded piece of burlap, was a black leather notebook, a diary. The leather cover was wrinkled, the stitching around the edges missing in 2 corners. Sarah looked at the notebook for a long time before opening it, a feeling of something undefined surging within her, half fear, half anticipation. The first entry was dated March 3rd, 1977. Elijah wrote as if talking to himself. Met with Clara this morning. She cried again about her husband, prayed with her. Micah said he dreamed of angels last night. My heart suddenly feels lighter. The early days were pastoral notes, ordinary and peaceful. But from the middle of the book onwards, Elijah's handwriting began to become uneven. The lines became hurried, sometimes stopping abruptly in the middle. George is becoming increasingly evasive. Harold signed a $4,800 voucher, but there's no invoice, no clear reason. And then a passage made Sarah almost drop the notebook. If they don't repent, I will go public. I can't stay silent forever. Beneath those words was a long pen stroke, as if Elijah had hesitated, but still decided to write on. I'm not afraid of losing my reputation, but I'm afraid for Micah. Afraid that if the truth comes out, someone will lose control. Sarah pressed her hand to the page, clearly feeling the ink that had dried decades ago. But to her, each line was a light touch from the departed. Not a plea for help, but a push. Keep going. She burst into tears. But this time, not because of pain, but because for the first time she understood Elijah. Understood why he never came back. Understood that he had seen the darkness in what had once been the most sacred place in their lives. She placed the diary on the table and pulled out the expenditure book from the church. Under the flickering yellow light, she began to compare. May £5, $200 for sound system repair, matching the entry where Elijah wrote, "System not broken," but George said it needed to be replaced for safety. July spent on special security services, matching the diary entry. 2 strangers appeared at the church. No one explained who brought them. Piece by piece began to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle she had unconsciously collected for nearly 30 years. Sarah took out her personal notebook, opened to a blank page, and began to write quickly. Elijah was tracking expenses intended to disclose, then disappeared with Micah. The next line was slower, heavier. If someone was threatened by the truth, then they had enough motive to kill. She sat still for a moment, looking at the page she had just written. It was completely dark outside, the wind blowing, making the window frame rattle slightly. Sarah stood up, returned to the living room, and took the dust-covered landline phone. She dialed each number slowly, her hand still trembling, the number of Carl Jennings. The only man who had ever believed she wasn't delusional. One ring, then 2, then 3. After the click of the receiver, a deep, hoarse male voice rang out, as if blown through by the wind of time. "Jennings here. Who's calling?" Sarah took a deep breath, gripping the phone tightly. "It's me. Sarah Freeman." Silence. No breathing, no movement on the other end of the line. Then the voice spoke slow and sure. "Sarah?" A pause. It's finally come back, hasn't it?" Sarah swallowed hard. "I found Elijah's bag in the Wachita forest. There's a Bible and Jojo." This time his breath was clear through the phone. Quiet, prolonged. Then he said, his voice no longer surprised, but only something like weariness that had been lifted. "I've been waiting for this call for nearly 30 years. The next morning, before the sun had fully penetrated the early morning mist, Sarah left the town of Eldridge, heading north where the trail led into the sparse forest. Patches of muddy road rolled beneath her car, the reeds along the roadside bending as if bowing to someone returning. Where she was going was a humble log cabin nestled among the shadows of old trees. No license plate, no doorbell, just a yellow light hanging on the porch that was still on, as if the owner had been up for a long time. Carl Jennings opened the door as soon as she stepped onto the first wooden step. He said nothing, just gestured for her to come in. Sarah had never forgotten this man, thin frame, high cheekbones, greying moustache, and deep brown eyes full of understanding. The interior of the house was neat and rigidly organized. The space was quiet. The walls hung with maps, black and white photos, and notes taped with brown tape. In the middle of the main wall was a satellite map of the town of Eldridge, small red dots marking around the Wachita forest and the Mount Olive Church Cemetery. "You look very different, only your eyes are the same," Carl said, his voice hoarse and slow. "Still the eyes of someone who doesn't give up." Sarah nodded slightly, placing the notebook on the table. "I need the truth. I'm sure my husband and son didn't just disappear." Carl sat down opposite her. He pulled out an old file, the edges of the paper yellowed, the spine taped with wrinkled tape. "I investigated for 3 weeks before I was pulled off the case." No official reason other than a so-called personnel restructuring. But I knew someone didn't want me asking too many questions. He pulled out a black and white photo, placing it in the middle of the table. The photo was taken on October the 10th, 1977. Elijah stood in the middle, clutching the Bible tightly. Harold stood to his right, his hand on his shoulder in a gesture of intimacy, but his eyes were cold as steel. George was on the left head, bowed, not looking at the camera. Elijah looked tense, as if preparing to say something important or holding back something he didn't dare reveal. This photo has never been published. I kept it because in all the photos taken at the service, this is the only time Elijah wasn't smiling. Carl paused for a moment, then opened the file cabinet, pulling out a copy of the church cemetery map. I also managed to discover something even more suspicious before I was forced to stop. Look at plot number 17. It says it's a dog's grave named Buddy. The time it was identified was right after your husband and son disappeared. But when I checked the cemetery archives, there was no burial application, no confirmation from a vet, no owner. The tombstone just says, "Rest easy, Buddy." No date of birth, no date of death. Sarah stared at the red circle. Mount Olive Cemetery was where she used to take Micah to light candles for All Saints' Day. She remembered each path, each tombstone very well. But grave number 17 had never left an impression. It was simple old and hidden behind a large juniper tree, easy to overlook. If someone needs to bury a person without anyone noticing, then setting up a pet grave is the easiest way, Carl continued. No one suspects a white stone, especially in a sacred place like a cemetery. Sarah gripped the notebook tightly. She flipped back to her notes from last night, Elijah's diary entries, the unaccounted expenses, the photo full of emotional distance. Put them together and plot number 17 now became the center. If Elijah was killed and buried there, she whispered. Carl sat still for a moment, his eyes never leaving the map. If that's true, he said slowly, then we're sitting in front of the grave of a man betrayed by the very people who used to stand beside him on the pulpit. He turned to Sarah. But if Elijah is there, where is Micah? Sarah looked at him. Her eyes filled not only with fear, but with the long-standing pain that had just surfaced again. She asked, if you're right, and Elijah was killed, what about Micah? Carl didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes facing the window where the black forest appeared in broad daylight. We need to find the first body, he said, his voice as quiet as the earth. Then, the next question can be allowed to be asked. Night covered Eldridge with a thin, icy mist, making even the pine trees as silent as accomplices. Carl stopped the car nearly 100 meters from Mount Olive Cemetery, where the back fence had rotted over the years. The two got out small flashlights gripped tightly in their hands, the light dim enough to illuminate the dirt road littered with gravel. Sarah clutched the red-marked cemetery map, walking close to Carl without saying a word. As they approached grave number 17, weeds had grown to ankle height, brushing against their shoes like small hands tugging. On the grass, a pale white stone appeared, no name, no date. Just an anonymous stone among hundreds of named tombstones. Sarah bent down using her gloves to sweep the grass around the edge of the stone, her eyes stopping where the ground seemed to sink slightly. Carl opened the canvas bag, took out a metal soil tester, and inserted it lightly into the four corners of the area. Each time he pulled it up, he smelled the soil, shaking his head. But when he got to the spot right at the foot of the tombstone, he stopped. "Filled soil newer," he said. Then, as if to verify, he took a small shovel, tapping lightly on the ground where the echo returned more hollow than usual. Both fell silent, with only the sound of wind rustling through the leaves and the increasingly rapid breathing. Suddenly, a small crack rang out from the row of willows at the end of the cemetery. Sarah stood up, her flashlight sweeping towards the sound. A tall figure, hooded, stood quietly in the darkness, not moving, not speaking. Carl pulled a folding knife from his pocket, gripping it tightly. "Who's there?" The man slowly stepped into the light. Hunched back, worn leather jacket, hand clutching a worn-tipped walking stick. When he looked up, Sarah recognized those eyes. A look she had seen at funerals, quiet and tired. "I know what you're doing," he said. "And I know I shouldn't interfere, but I used to see Elijah." Carl lowered his knife, approaching. "Who are you?" "Luther," the man replied. "I used to be a carpenter for Mount Olive for 20 years. No one remembers me. They only call when there's heavy work, dirty work." His voice was hoarse, trembling, but unmistakable. He looked at the white stone, then said slowly, One night in late October 1977, George called me to the church at midnight, said I had to fix a basement door that was stuck. When I got there, I saw Harold was there too, but no one let me touch the door. Instead, George gave me money up front, then told me to help them drag an old pulpit from the cart to the basement. Pulpit? Sarah asked. Luther shook his head. I used to make pulpits, but what they asked for wasn't what I make. It was long, heavy, and covered with a tarp as if hiding something. When I asked, George snapped, "Don't ask too many questions. Take the money, shut your mouth, and get to work." I dragged it along, but from that moment on I knew I shouldn't know what was under that tarp. Pulpit? Sarah asked, her voice calm, but her eyes never leaving Luther. He shook his head slowly. I used to make pulpits, many of them I knew every grain of wood, every weight. But what they asked me for that night wasn't wood, at least not just wood. He shuddered slightly as if that memory was still smouldering beneath his skin. It was long, strangely heavy, and completely covered with a thick tarp. When I asked, George got angry, snapped, "Don't ask too many questions. Take the money, shut your mouth, and get to work." Sarah was silent for a moment, then asked directly without beating around the bush. "The grave in plot number 17, the Buddy grave, is that where they buried Elijah?" Luther looked at her, his eyes flickering slightly. But then he shook his head, certain. "No, not there." "Are you sure? How do you know?" Luther sat up straight for the first time since the beginning of the story. He put his hand on the table as if to affirm each word. "Because I was the one who poured the cement foundation over that spot after they finished burying it." His voice dropped. "I was the one who laid the soil, plastered the first layer of mortar. There was nothing underneath but dirt and sand. No shape, no bag, no smell. Just an empty grave set up to mislead, I think." Sarah gripped the notebook in her arms, her lips pursed tightly. "So, what you helped them drag down to the basement? Could be Elijah," Luther said directly, no longer avoiding. "Or evidence, or both. But if you want to know where Elijah really is, I'm afraid I can't help anymore." After a moment, he looked at her, the eyes that had been avoiding now more honest, more truthful. "I don't know where they took that thing. I only know one thing for sure. Elijah is not under that fake grave." Carl stepped closer. "And have you told anyone?" "No," Luther replied immediately. "I kept silent because I knew it. Could be dangerous for me and maybe for others too. But I haven't slept well since that night." He looked straight at Sarah. "I can't say anything more here." "Meet me at the old wood shop next to Route 12, tomorrow morning, if I'm still alive and can get there." Then, without waiting for any more words, Luther turned his back, disappearing into the darkness, as if he had never existed. Carl quickly recorded the coordinates of the wood shop in his notebook. Sarah still stood there, her eyes following the deserted trail where Luther's shadow disappeared. She turned back to look at the anonymous white stone. In her head, Elijah's voice suddenly rang out like a dying wish through the old diary. "If they silence me, then others will speak." And now that word had begun to speak in the middle of the night, in the cemetery beneath the unspoken. The next morning, when the dew was still lingering on the car windows and the sky in Eldridge was just turning pale blue, Carl took Sarah to a place that wasn't on the official map of the town, the old woodshop on Route 12. It was a rough wooden house, the tin roof leaning to one side, the walls covered with moss and the windows taped to prevent wind. There was no doorbell, only the sound of a handsaw faintly coming from the back. Luther was sitting in front of a long wooden table, cutting the scraps left over from an old project. When Carl and Sarah appeared, he didn't look up right away. "I thought maybe no one would come," he said, as if continuing a conversation that had been left unfinished from last night. Inside the woodshop was another world, quiet, stifling with the smell of rotting wood and covered with fine dust of sawdust. On the wall were a few old photos, most of them faded, attached with small nails. Sarah stopped in front of a photo. She saw her own son Micah, about 7 years old, smiling broadly, standing next to Luther, holding a newly made wooden wheel. A vivid moment among the years that had been torn from her family's history. Luther stepped forward, wiping his hands with a rag, his eyes slowly looking into Sarah's eyes. "I'll tell you everything." "Unless you're not ready to hear the unforgivable." Sarah didn't avoid, nodded. "I've been ready since I stepped down into the basement of memories." Luther sat down, leaning slightly on the scratched wooden table, and began to tell, his voice deep, even not trembling, as if he had told the story to himself thousands of times in silence. "After that night, I didn't go back to the church. But there's one thing you need to know before George called me 2 days before that Harold visited the woodshop. That's rare, because he doesn't like me. He asked me to make a piece of wood like a pulpit, but shorter and empty inside." Sarah leaned forward slightly, listening to every word. "Empty? I mean, empty inside like a box." I asked what it was for. Harold just said, "Props for children's class. We're going to hide something inside and tell the kids to find it." I didn't believe it. Looking at his eyes, I knew he never cared about children. "Do you still have the drawings?" "No, but I remember the dimensions. About as long as an adult lying down as tall as a knee. I just knew I had built a coffin without being allowed to name it." Luther paused for a moment, gripping the rag. "After I brought that to the church, I didn't see it anywhere. Not in the warehouse, not in the yard. Then 3 nights later, George called. The lights were still on. That heavy pulpit seemed to have been ready on the cart." "Are you sure it was the same thing? Same size, same way of being covered with black tarpaulin wrapped with the rope I used to use. And there was a diagonal scratch that only I knew because I had accidentally nailed the left side. They used what I made, but not to teach children." Sarah breathed out softly, then asked, her voice low, "So if they didn't bury Elijah in the cemetery, what did they do after that?" Luther shook his head. "I think that cart was in the basement, at least for a while, but they didn't keep it there long. I used to see another night very late. Harold went behind the church into the woods towards the big oak trees, carrying a shovel. I followed for a few minutes, then got scared, didn't dare to step further." Sarah was silent, her heart pounding heavily in her chest. "And you know," Luther whispered, "the next day the biggest oak tree had a small cross carved with a knife. No one noticed, but I did." Carl bowed his head, recording every detail. Sarah stood silently. The images in Elijah's diary and Luther's story in the photo taken the night before became a gloomy, logical sequence. The most sacred place could be the place where the first crime was committed. Luther suddenly handed over a small piece of paper. "There's one more person. If you want to know what Elijah feared most, meet Ruth Ann, the old church secretary. She retired in 1978, now lives at Southfield Nursing Home. But she was the only person Elijah trusted. After you." As Carl and Sarah left the woodshop, the sun was scorching. No one said anything. They both sat quietly in the car, only hearing the sound of tires creaking lightly on gravel. Sarah opened her notebook, writing on a new page, "To unmask the killer, must overturn the layer of his doctrinal mask first. Where they prayed, maybe where they committed the crime. She closed the notebook, her eyes hardening as she looked towards the cemetery in the distance where the white stones were no longer symbols of rest, but the door leading to a deeply buried truth. Southfield Nursing Home was located on a low hill overlooking the eastern fields of Eldridge. The red brick building's silver-colored tiled roof, the frosty stained glass windows, like the eyes of those who had looked too long at the past. As Sarah entered, the atmosphere was silently cold, not because of the air conditioning, but because time seemed to have stopped in every wall, every long hallway smelling of disinfectant. Ruth Ann sat alone by the second-floor window, the afternoon light shining through, making her hair even whiter than her sweater. She was small, hunched, thick glasses, like blurred lenses, her unfocused eyes drifting as if lost in old winters. Sarah approached, gently unhurried. She placed a small photo frame on the table, Elijah hugging Micah, both smiling under the large oak tree next to the church. At first, Ruth didn't react. She just blinked slowly, but then for a moment, that aimless gaze suddenly stopped. She tilted her head, her thin fingers trembling as she touched the edge of the photo. "I remember Micah. He screamed," she whispered, her eyes fading, but her voice as sharp as a knife. "But I didn't dare open the door." Sarah didn't interrupt. She sat close, taking her hand. They sat in silence for a moment, with only the ticking of the old wall clock ringing regularly, the only sound keeping the rhythm in the memory-stained room. Ruth stirred slightly. Her eyelids drooped, then opened again as if searching for the shadow of a distant evening that had been imprisoned behind her mind. Her voice rose hoarse, but even each word as if lifted by a trembling hand. "That night, Elijah came to the records room, told me to open it, but the lock had been changed the day before. No one told me. I didn't have a key. I remember Elijah was angry. His eyes, I had never seen them like that." She was silent, then continued in a choking voice. "At midnight, I heard footsteps. Then the screaming of children, the sound of breaking, like glass or stone statues falling. Then silence, as silent as a morgue." Sarah felt her heart clenching. Ruth took a deep, difficult breath, then almost confessed, "I was just a secretary." The next morning, Harold gave me a new set of reports, told me to type them again. The old pages were gone. I didn't dare ask. I didn't dare ask. She looked at Sarah like a child begging for forgiveness, then rested her head in her arms. "I heard but didn't do anything. I'm a survivor, but I'm also an accomplice." Sarah hugged her, not saying anything, not judging, just feeling the trembling breath on her shoulder, a confession that didn't need a sentence, just needed to be heard. On the way back, it got dark faster than usual. The wind pulled strongly through the rows of willows next to the institute, making the leaves sweep rustling on the road. Sarah opened her notebook, writing, "Someone heard, someone saw. They were silent, but now they have spoken." At the same time that morning, when the sunlight was still filtering through the dense oak leaves behind Mount Olive Cemetery, Carl Jennings had returned to the scene alone, a place that 30 years earlier he had been forbidden to set foot in because it was no longer under investigative authority. Carrying an old map of the church superimposed on the latest color print satellite image from the County Land Registry database, he groped through each row of tombstones, each bush of grass taller than his knees. Carl walked to the last row of trees in the cemetery. There, an old oak tree looked as if it had died years ago. The trunk cracked, the roots protruding from the ground, no different from the fake mound of earth. When he pressed his heel on it, the ground underneath did not compress like the other areas, but sank slightly softer than usual. Carl bent down, using a knife to make a small cut. The soil was a different color, as if it had been refilled from elsewhere, the color of young soil not suitable for the age of the tree. He used his phone to photograph it, then pulled out the hand-drawn map he had prepared. A red pen was drawn right where he was standing. He stood silently for a moment, looking at the tree root, then turned away, not out of fear, but because he knew he had just touched a truth that had been buried for too long. Only when he sat back in the pickup truck did he dial Sarah's number. The phone in her pocket rang softly. She opened the phone. Carl's voice rang out, decisive. "Sarah, I just got something. What we need." She pulled the car over to the side of the road, opened the electronic map that Carl had just sent. On the screen, the latest satellite image of the Mount Olive Cemetery area, and below it, a hand-drawn map, scrawled but clear. A red X marked directly under the handwritten note, "Oak root behind the cemetery, inconsistent soil layer." Under the car lights, Sarah closed her eyes, hearing faintly in her mind Elijah's voice as he had written in his diary, "If they silence me, then others will speak." And now others had begun to speak. But that layer of earth had not yet burst open, and the truth was still there, waiting to be unearthed. The next morning, dawn cut across the distant mountains like a faint golden slash. The cold air made each breath of Sarah and Carl appear in the air thin as incense smoke. They stood beside the old oak root, where Carl's hand-drawn map had marked with a red X behind the Mount Olive Cemetery, completely hidden from the main path, where there were only roots, sunken ground, and dense shadows. Carl silently held the shovel. Sarah stood beside him, her gloves gripped tightly. No one said anything. They just started digging, each stroke slow, heavy, as if scooping up layers of rotten belief. The soil here was different, looser, softer. The musty smell of tree roots mixed with something metallic damp. Less than half an hour later, Carl stopped. The tip of the shovel touched something that wasn't soil soft, but with resistance. They both leaned down, clearing the soil with their hands. A layer of rotten fabric appeared, old burlap grey-brown, corroded by water and time. The smell of rusty iron rose, mixed with a strong, musty odor. Sarah covered her nose, but her eyes didn't leave. Carl used a knife to slit the fabric lightly. Inside was bone, a lower jaw, parts of the chest and arm bones that had fallen apart. Next to it was a notebook, black leather scorched around the edges. Carl reached out and lifted it gently. The leather was stained with dried blood, the cover heavy with old moisture. Sarah tremblingly opened it, a few lines still readable on the middle page. The writing was old, but steadfast. "I forgive them, but the truth needs to be told." Sarah couldn't hold herself back any longer. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she picked up the blood-stained piece of paper, pressing it to her chest, as if wanting to hear again every heartbeat of the husband who had disappeared from this world but had never left her heart. A sob burst out, not a soft cry, but a shattering, a bursting of pain that had been compressed for too long. Sarah cried, not just because of the loss, but because finally Elijah had been found. No longer a missing person, no longer a name whispered behind her back in silent ceremonies. He was evidence. He was the truth. And he was someone who could not be buried again. Carl stood beside her, his eyes red but not interfering. Elijah was here, under the ground, but no longer hidden, no longer a rumor, no longer an anonymous victim. Sarah embraced the ministerial notebook as if embracing a heart that had been taken away for decades. Then, as the crying subsided, as her breathing returned to normal, she looked at Carl, her eyes still red, but her voice steady. "He has been found." A pause. She swallowed hard. "What about Micah?" Carl was silent, but his gaze didn't waver. Sarah nodded. "There's nothing here to prove that Micah is also under the ground. No trace. No traces of children's clothing. No Jojo." A light fragile flickered in her eyes. "As long as I haven't seen evidence, I will believe that my son is still alive." And in that moment, her tears were still wet, but her eyes had fire no longer, just pain, but determination. Elijah had been brought to light. Now it was time to find the rest of her heart, Micah. The police were immediately called. A small group arrived at the scene, initially skeptical but quickly silent when they saw the ministerial notebook, the Bible next to the skeleton, and the dried bloodstains still printed on the edge of the cover. A forensic team confirmed immediately the bones showed signs of a male gender aged 40-50 years old. Preliminary DNA results based on records remaining from the day Elijah disappeared confirmed the suspicion the body was that of Reverend Elijah Freeman. Sarah stood a few steps away as the body was put on a stretcher covered with a white sheet. As the forensic vehicle slowly rolled away, she stepped forward, not crying, not screaming, just whispering, "You are no longer lying under the ground, Elijah. They will hear you. The proof is that your body is still here." The sky suddenly became windy. The oak leaves fell around them like evidence falling from the sky, quietly but undeniable. And Sarah knew that this was only the beginning for the rest of the hidden truth. Micah had not yet spoken, but Elijah had been heard. And now no one could cover their ears anymore. The meeting room behind the sanctuary of Mount Olive Church had never witnessed a meeting like this morning. There were no church bells, no prayers, just 4 people, and the truth about to be laid straight on the table. No explanation needed, no miracle needed. The door closed behind Sarah and Carl with a cold, heavy click. Harold was already sitting down, tall and thin, wearing a well-fitting grey vest, his hands interlaced on the table. His eyes slowly swept over Carl, then stopped on Sarah, as if looking at a lost child. "I hope you haven't come here to stir up the past," he said, in a voice as deep and even as reading the Bible. George entered later, not looking at anyone, his sunken eyes full of distraction. Carl placed a thick file on the table, opening each page carefully. "This is the diary of Reverend Elijah," he said, his voice without a hint of emotion. "The expenditure records from 1976-1977, along with photos of the shady expenses." He slid over a handwritten analysis, pointing to Harold's signature on the vouchers. "This signature has been compared with other samples. The signature is fake." Harold didn't change his expression. He just curled his lip, as if listening to a poor sermon. Carl continued this time, placing a print of the scene on the table: Elijah's body, wrapped in rotten burlap, the scorched ministerial notebook, and the words still clear, "I forgive them." But the truth needs to be told. Sarah took out her notebook, opened to the last page, reading slowly the passage Elijah had written. If they are silent, I will speak. If they silence me, God will use others. She looked up, looking directly into George's eyes. Today, do you choose to be the one who silences or the one who speaks? George squirmed. His eyes evaded hers. His hands gripped the edge of his jacket tightly. His mouth opened as if to answer, but no sound came out. Harold still sat as still as a statue, but the corner of his mouth was now curled into a faint, cold smile. You don't understand how the church operates, he said softly. Order must be maintained. Sometimes, the truth is the most dangerous thing in God's house, and everything needs to be eliminated to maintain order. Carl looked at Sarah, then gathered the files. It's not the church that's threatened, but the evil nature of a few people dressed in doctrine. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number quickly. I will transfer all these documents to the police department and the county court, requesting procedures for an arrest warrant. In the quiet atmosphere before the storm, Sarah stood up. Elijah didn't die in an accident. He didn't disappear because God called him. He was killed because he refused to be silent. But now, he has been heard. She looked at each of the men in front of her, one trembling one trying to stand firm on the tower of dogma. But both were collapsing not because of cries, but because of the irremovable evidence. The truth had entered this meeting room, and for the first time in nearly 30 years, none of them could deny it anymore. The arrest warrant was issued on Monday morning. Sarah and Carl stood outside the churchyard as the Eldridge County Police appeared with 2 patrol cars entering the main hall where Harold was holding an early prayer session for a small group of loyal followers. The police officer read the warrant, his voice decisive. Harold Greaves, you are arrested on charges of first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and corruption. Harold did not answer. He stepped back a step, as if he had not fully understood those words. Then his eyes shifted from confusion to anger, then to something that Sarah recognized immediately: calculation. You have no authority in God's house, he said loudly, his voice still carrying the tone of preaching. I have the right to call a lawyer, and I have someone above who will not let this happen. As the police officer approached, Harold suddenly pushed the pulpit over, causing the stack of Bibles to fall. He rushed towards the back door which led to the old mezzanine. A young officer chased after him, but was blocked by the closing door. Sarah stood still, not running, not shouting. She knew Harold couldn't escape. Not the truth. Not himself. 15 minutes later, they dragged him out of the warehouse behind, where he had tried to climb the fence into the woods. His collar was torn, his face scratched, and his eyes had now lost their arrogance, replaced by the naked panic of someone who had seen the cliff where his power ended. A month later, Eldridge was no longer a place of whispers in the dark. Maybe they are waiting for a reason to believe that the truth still has value, even if it has been buried for a long time. We cannot change what has happened, but we can choose not to be silent. Share this story. Who knows, somewhere someone needs to be heard, right when they think that no one is listening anymore.